In the early summer of 2025, the world's attention swung back to one of the most dangerous flashpoints on Earth, a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman. Through this maritime choke point flows nearly a fifth of all seaborne oil. Any disruption here could ignite energy markets, disrupt global trade, and draw regional rivals into open conflict. Now, as tensions between Iran, the United States, Israel, and Gulf allies spike after a new round of military strikes, the question is being asked with renewed urgency. Is Iran really about to close the Strait of Hormuz? And how did a US base in Qatar become the target of Iranian missiles? The Strait of Hormuz is a 33-kilometer wide passage linking the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. At its narrowest, the shipping lane for giant oil tankers is only a few kilometers across. Roughly 20% of the world's seaborne crude oil, much of it destined for Asia and Europe, must transit this narrow corridor. Any closure, even temporary, can send oil prices soaring. Past crises, from the Iran-Iraq tanker war in the 1980s to periodic Iranian threats in the 2010s, have shown how sensitive the world economy is to the security of these waters. On June 22, 2025, the United States launched a large-scale air campaign against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. The operation, known by the codename Midnight Hammer, targeted key facilities at Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. Washington said the strikes were designed to degrade Iran's ability to enrich uranium to weapons-grade levels. Military analysts noted the use of bunker-buster ordnance and long-range cruise missiles combined with stealth aircraft sorties. The Trump administration framed the action as a necessary step to prevent Iran from crossing what it described as a nuclear threshold. The decision was condemned by Tehran as an act of war. Within hours, Iran's parliament passed a motion calling for the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The vote was largely symbolic. The actual decision lies with Iran's Supreme National Security Council and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, but it signaled how far Tehran was prepared to go. The next evening, June 23rd, Iran responded directly. Its forces launched a volley of ballistic missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest US military installation in the region and a key hub for air operations over the Gulf. Qatar and US officials reported that most of the incoming missiles were intercepted, and initial statements claimed there were no casualties. Later, commercial satellite imagery suggested limited damage to a radar installation. Tehran described the strike as measured retaliation for the US bombing of its nuclear sites. The Pentagon said it had anticipated such a response and had repositioned some assets in advance. The attack nonetheless underscored that Iran was willing to extend the confrontation beyond its borders. Even as the missile strike drew headlines, US intelligence agencies were tracking another development. Iranian naval vessels, reportedly loaded with sea mines and fast attack craft, moving towards staging areas near the Strait of Hormuz. Western officials said this raised concern that Tehran might try to enforce at least a partial blockade. International reaction was swift. The United States called the move a red line and urged partners to keep shipping lanes open. Washington appealed to China, one of Iran's largest oil customers, to pressure Tehran not to proceed, warning that closing the strait would be economic suicide. European and Gulf leaders also warned that such a step could trigger a wider war. Even without an actual closure, oil prices jumped and insurance premiums for ships transiting the Gulf spiked, underscoring how vulnerable global markets are to the mere threat. Analysts caution that while the rhetoric is heated, a full shutdown of Hormuz remains unlikely. Such a move would also cripple Iran's own ability to export its oil and natural gas, a lifeline for the country's already strained economy. Western naval forces, from the US Fifth Fleet in Bahrain to British and French assets, maintain a strong presence in the Gulf, equipped for rapid mine clearing and convoy protection. A sustained closure attempt could draw a direct and overwhelming military response. Experts therefore believe that Iran's threat is as much about deterrence and leverage in negotiations as it is about actual blockade plans. Still, the danger of miscalculation is high, and even a temporary disruption, such as mining a few lanes or harassing tankers, could send shockwaves through global markets. As the crisis entered a tense holding pattern, analysts mapped out several potential paths forward, each carrying very different risks for the region and the world economy. Iran could continue to brandish the threat of closing the strait, but stop short of taking irreversible military action. In this path, back-channel talks, possibly involving mediators such as Oman, Qatar, or even China, would seek to prevent further escalation, trading restraint in the Gulf for limits on future US or Israeli strikes. Instead of an outright closure, Iran might use fast attack boats, drones, or limited mine laying to harass shipping, aiming to raise the economic costs for rivals without inviting an all-out military response. This grey zone approach has precedent. Similar tactics were used during the so-called tanker war of the 1980s. The most extreme path would be an attempt by Iran's Revolutionary Guard to mine or militarily seal off the strait altogether. Such a move would almost certainly trigger a US-led military intervention to reopen the sea lanes with unpredictable and potentially catastrophic consequences. Global energy markets are already on edge. Even a brief disruption could drive oil prices far above current levels, ripple through supply chains, and fuel inflation worldwide. For Washington, for Beijing, and for energy importing nations from Europe to South Asia, the stakes could not be higher. For now, the Strait of Hormuz remains open, but the crisis has underlined just how easily a single flashpoint can threaten a global artery of trade. Iran's threats to close the waterway, the US strikes on nuclear sites, and the missile attack on Al Udeid in Qatar together form a chain of escalation that could still spiral if diplomacy falters. Each player, from Tehran and Washington to Gulf capitals, Beijing and European allies, now faces the task of averting that spiral. For international observers, the key indicators to watch in the coming weeks are Iran's naval deployments, any renewed mining activity, and the tenor of diplomatic exchanges between Tehran, Washington, and mediators. Whether the world moves toward compromise or confrontation in the Gulf may hinge on decisions taken not in the narrow waters of Hormuz itself, but in distant capitals, in Washington, in Tehran, in Beijing, where strategy and restraint are weighed against ambition and risk. Mining of shipping lanes using moored and drifting mines. Iran has stockpiles and experience from the 1980s, swarm tactics by fast attack boats to harass or impede tankers, deployment of coastal anti-ship missiles and drones, cyber operations against port or tanker navigation systems. US-led naval coalition has mined countermeasure ships, drones and air superiority, convoy and escort tactics as used during the 1987 to 1988 Earnest Will operation, likely rapid military response to any sustained attempt at closure. During the Iran-Iraq tanker war, 1980s, both sides targeted commercial shipping. The US reflagged and escorted Kuwaiti tankers. In 2011 to 2012, Iranian officials again threatened to close the strait amid nuclear tensions, leading to a surge in oil prices, but never acted. Iran's own oil revenues, critical for its budget, depend on the same sea route. Any prolonged disruption would provoke not just military retaliation, but also intense diplomatic and economic isolation. The crisis underscores the global interdependence of energy flows and maritime security. History shows that the Strait of Hormuz has long been a point where regional rivalries, global energy needs, and maritime vulnerability meet. The latest showdown between Iran, the United States, and their allies reminds the world that this strategic corridor can turn overnight from a peaceful trade route into a front line of conflict. The coming weeks will reveal whether the threat to close Hormuz was a bargaining tactic or the opening move in a new and dangerous chapter in Gulf geopolitics.